We are now going to hear from Carl Caton. He is the president of the Marriage Initiative and managing director of National Marriage Week. He serves on the board of NARME and is deeply invested in strengthening families and communities through marriage, parenting, and fatherhood work. Carl focuses on bringing people together through community-based strategies, and he's passionate about seeing families thrive. He and his high school sweetheart, Kelly, have 2 kids and 5 grandchildren. Would you please join me in welcoming Carl Caton to the podium?
Okay, we're going to talk about this crazy idea of an emerging marriage renaissance. Okay, we're gonna have a little age check here. Who was old enough in 1972 to kind of remember what was going on then? Anybody remember what was going on in 1972? It was a pretty groovy time, baby. I mean, man, some of the clothes were far out and right on. But not everything that was happening in 1972 was far out or groovy. I want to take you to a day in April 2nd, 1972. Sam, your hometown. A drama was unfolding in the courthouse of the district court in Howard County, Texas. Throughout the morning, the court was filled with the acrimony and the testimony of a custody battle. Divorcing parents were fighting who would get the children. And after the back and forth and seeing that things were going nowhere, the judge called for a recess. He asked the kids that were involved in the case, they were sitting outside in the hallway, to come back to his judge's chamber alone. He had questions for them. Sitting in the worn leather chair of the judge's chamber was a petite 12-year-old girl with curly blonde hair. And her brother was sitting right beside her. She was much too small for the big chair, her feet not quite touching the floor. And the judge simply asked the kids which parent do they want to live with. The little girl spoke up. She said, "I want to live with my mom." And that was the ending of that case. Case closed, meeting adjourned, long morning ends with a quick and decisive ending. The interesting part of this story is that little girl with the curly blonde hair was my wife. I need to quit looking at you, Sam. And the judge in the case was my dad. And you thought you had interesting family of origin issues. Fast forward to our wedding, and the judge is my best man, and the defendant is walking the bride down the aisle. But anyway, in that day of April 2nd, 1972, when my dad came home to our house, our family was living a story that was just as broken, because despite my dad's extraordinary stature and courage, the divorce mill, as he called it, drove him to depression. In that year of 1972, our country was experiencing a significant shift in culture, a cultural inflection point. My dad's courtroom had become overwhelmed by a storm of no-fault divorces which were flooding courtrooms all across the country. It was sudden, unexpected, and truly unprecedented. Just a few years prior, Governor Ronald Reagan of California had signed the very first no-fault divorce legislation, and to the surprise and shock of everyone, no-fault divorce spread like a tidal wave across the country. It was a powerful cultural inflection point, but it wasn't new. Over the past 200 years, there have been 4 very significant cultural inflection points involving marriage: 1870, 1917, 1969, and 2020. And there have been 4 50-year periods that have aligned with these cultural inflection points where marriage has risen and fallen. And I want you to pay attention to this. From 1820 to 1870, marriage was on the rise. From 1870 to 1920, marriage was in steep decline. From 1920 to 1970, marriage was on the rise again, this time setting record highs. And then 1970 to 2020, you know the story, marriage is in decline. At each point, the cultural view of marriage shifted radically. But the cultural shift, most like what we're experiencing today, happened in 1917. Rewinding back to that day of 1917, it was, again, much like today. Marriage had been declining for 50 years. Isn't that amazing to think about? Through what was called the Progressive Era. It was described as a season of fierce discontent. Women were uniformly angry with men, and for good reason. Men were drinking too much, they were gambling too much, and they were abandoning their responsibilities. By 1889, hear me, 1889, the United States, for the first time, led the world in divorce. And in the decade from 1890 to 1900, divorce quadrupled. It was referred to as the divorce decade. America, friends, was alarmed. It was so concerning, and there was so much widespread concern that President Teddy Roosevelt convened a group called the National Congress on Uniform Divorce Laws to draft measures controlling divorce. The convening noted that the proportion of divorces to marriages is increasing with alarming rapidity. That's a TR statement. But more poignantly, listen to this. Families were everywhere breaking up. In a single year, though, that 50-year downtrend in marriage ended because in 1917, 4.5 million men that we were so angry with, well, they voluntarily signed up to go to war to fight for our freedom in World War I. Marianne spoke about that earlier. And the cultural downtrend ended in a single year as women gained a new respect for men, or actually, women gained a deeper insight into men, which was, men can behave badly, right? But we can also act heroically. The cultural inflection of 1917 teaches us something very important, that cultural change can be sudden, dramatic, and unexpected. So why is it that culture can shift so suddenly? The answer lies in the understanding that there's a deeper, far more powerful force at culture that drives this thing that is utterly silent. Because most often when we talk about culture, we're speaking of the cultural narrative. That's the outward expression of culture, which is the shared system of beliefs with the values and the practices that shape society. That said, there is a deeper, far more powerful force at work, which is human longing. Friends, this is what drives culture, not the cultural narrative. Human longing is the silent force beneath every cultural tide. The narrative is just simply how we give it voice. So let me use a metaphor here. Picture yourself standing at the edge of the ocean as a hurricane approaches. The wind and rain and crashing waves, these are the visible signs of that hurricane, but also the visible signs of culture. In culture, it's the voices of politicians and influencers and activists and media who share the cultural narrative. They're loud and dramatic and impossible to ignore, right? Just like a hurricane approaching. But even as you experience the power of a hurricane, there's something even more powerful at work right there beneath your feet. The rise and the fall of the tide, driven by the silent yet profoundly powerful gravitational force of the moon itself. As powerful as the hurricane can seem in that moment, can you imagine that? There's something that's 1,000 times more powerful that's utterly silent beneath your feet. You see, the outward expression of culture, it gets all the attention. But culture is ultimately driven by human longing, the biological tide. So you remember those 4 50-year periods that I was talking about, the rise and the fall? The outward expression made all the headlines. But each 50-year period ended with an unexpected cultural shift driven by something silent yet profoundly more powerful, a shift in human longing. Now, we're going to go deep on this. Why is there this ebb and flow of human longing? Why does the biological tide flow in and then out? It's because there's two core human longings that relate specifically to marriage. And those are autonomy and connection. When autonomy dominates in society, society emphasizes individualism and self-expression and personal achievement. Personal achievement was what the progressive era was all about. The cry is for liberation from family and tradition and societal expectations. But over time, this desire for autonomy becomes hyper-individualism, right? Leading to fragmentation and loneliness. People become lonely and isolated. And the biological pull towards connection kicks in. And then the culture shifts. Then culture begins to emphasize relationships and interdependence and shared purpose. Society prioritizes unity and family and tradition, but as the tide rises too far towards connection, it begins to feel stifling, right? Too much togetherness can be suffocating. And then individuals begin to crave autonomy again, and the tide recedes back towards personal freedom. You see the ebb and the flow of this? These are two core human longings, but they relate specifically to marriage. So you see the pattern here? 1820 to 1870, it was a time that was dominated by this longing for connection. We wanted each other. And then it shifts to autonomy. We wanted to express ourselves individually, but we got tired of that. And then from 1920 to 1970, we were longing for connection again. My goodness, we had 2 world wars and a depression. We needed each other. But we had so much togetherness, and Ozzie and Harriet, that we decided we wanted autonomy again. And the call for liberation during this time, and freedom from unhappy marriages, and the social experiment of no-fault divorce. We thought that was a good thing. You see, culture isn't shaped just by ideas, it's shaped by human pain and longing. Human longing is the silent force beneath every cultural tide. The narrative is simply how we give it voice. So let's bring this to today. What's happening today? I believe we are in the middle of a cultural shift that we're not really even paying attention to. A cultural inflection point. As we reach the end of this 50-year period between 1970 to 2020, we were seeing evidences of human longing for connection and return. We've been talking about it for 20 years. You remember, we were finding ourselves increasingly alone. Remember, we were bowling alone, remember? We were losing our collective identity, and deaths of despair were rising. And the Surgeon General, as many have said, declares this epidemic of loneliness. And then 2020 brings us something unimaginable. The earth went silent. At our loneliest moment, we found ourselves even more alone. I know you clearly remember those early images, those early moments of the pandemic, and especially those, for me, it was those haunting images of grandparents alone in nursing homes. That impacted me most. But even like the couples that were struggling with conflict and locked down, and from this time, I started seeing all these news reports. Well, we're going to have a divorce tsunami. It's going to impact our country. All of these dire predictions, they troubled me. And at the Marriage Initiative, we were like bracing ourselves for the worst. What do we need to do to react to the divorce tsunami that's coming? But instead of divorce rising, divorce fell dramatically, like never before. Because if you go back for 50 years in our community, divorce had been on this slow, gentle decline over 50 years, maybe increasing by 0.25% or decreasing by 0.75%. But when we finalized our 2023 divorce rate and data, divorce was down 8.5%. It was so surprising we didn't report it as much as we wanted to report. We wanted to report that. We didn't report it. And then in 2024, divorce fell by 15%. Friends, that sort of thing doesn't just happen. Statistics don't shift like that. And for the first time, I began to wake up and realize, hey, something different is going on here. We're not that good at our work in San Antonio, as much as I would like to think we were. I believe the pandemic became a period of social upheaval that we're not even recognizing yet, that disrupted the individualistic trends and accelerated a cultural shift back towards human connection. 2020 was a cultural inflection point driven by a renewed human longing for connection. Not just in marriage. Let me be clear. Not just in marriage, but certainly to include marriage, right? The staggering changes happening in this cultural moment leave us uneasy, right? When a cultural climate like widespread family fragmentation, when it lasts for 2 generations, it becomes our entire lived experience. It frames how we see the world, right? That's how I see the world. I see the world as a world of declining marriage and divorce. Social scientists call this ontological security. I needed to say one big word because I'm from West Texas. When the cultural climate begins to shift, it can provoke a sense of disorientation, or actually better said, tension. And we feel that tension in our bodies, right? And I want you to tell me if you feel the tension in the following statements, which reflect where we are today. Marriage is in a cultural conundrum. It is viewed today as both important and irrelevant. This creates tension. The tension surrounding marriage stem from 3 conflicting and overlapping realities. Number 1, the cultural narrative surrounding marriage is uniformly negative. Marriage is being widely abandoned. How many thousand times have you heard that? And yet, the human longing for belonging and relational security is increasing. The need for something like marriage is actually growing. And number 3, the social science data indicates the cultural narrative is wrong, and an important solution for the need for belonging and human flourishing is something like marriage. Here's the tension. Marriage is being widely abandoned, but we need it more than ever. You feel the tension in that? This leaves us feeling disoriented and collectively uncertain, right? Friends, what society is longing for is something like marriage. We're just not sure what we want. We know we don't want 1960s marriage. Okay, we're in agreement about that, but we can't collectively agree on what marriage might or should be. The collective pain we are feeling relates to this human longing for renewed connection. And in this moment, friends, society is waiting for someone to give us language, to tell stories that will resonate, to create a narrative that explains what is happening and why it matters. And if the narrative that is created resonates widely, it will become embedded in our cultural imagination. And it will shape how people see themselves, their relationships, and their society. And this new narrative will become the outward expression of the deeper longing for human connection that we currently feel. Friends, that's how culture shifts. It doesn't begin with a narrative. It begins with human pain and longing. So then, who should create this new narrative that reimagines marriage and family relationships? Should it be a Hollywood actor locked in the echo chamber of that part of the world? Friends, if we don't speak up, somebody will. The people who should craft this new narrative for marriage, of marriage and family, are sitting right here in this room today. You guys are the experts. Our collective understanding of the beauty and possibilities of marriage give us a unique voice, an honest voice, an informed voice in crafting this new narrative. We are uniquely aware of the research which highlights that married couples have greater health, financial stability, and personal happiness, as my friend Brad Wilcox has pointed out. And it is the best scenario for raising children, giving them the best chance at life. Friends, we stand at a remarkable moment in time, not to reinvent marriage or reframe marriage, but to understand the beauty and possibilities of marriage more deeply and in greater alignment with how we are created and in better reflection of how we are called to be a part of something larger than ourselves. Today's marriage can transcend both the survival necessity of the 1800s as well as the traditional role-playing of the 1960s to become a beautiful partnership of two whole people choosing to interweave their lives around shared meaning and purpose. This isn't about completing each other. This is about two complete individuals deciding to amplify their impact on the world together. And before we go too deep on this exciting, hopeful new message, we can't ignore the pain, because a lot of people would say, you don't know what I've been through in my marriage, right? Or you don't know what it's like to see my parents' marriage fail. And because there is so much personal and cultural pain around marriage, we often find ourselves operating in this space of cultural silence. Friends, it's important to note that people avoid talking about marriage not because it's irrelevant, but because it's painful, right? The silence is not a void, it's a vacuum, and a vacuum is a powerful place for redemptive leadership. Our work enters that silence not with shame, but with hope, not with judgment, but with invitation. We are creating a space where people can reimagine what they thought was lost. Friends, listen to this. The pain surrounding marriage is not a barrier to our work. It's why our work is needed. The reason why marriage no longer makes sense for so many people today is because we've lost the plot. Marriage only makes sense when it's part of a larger story. And I want you to think for a minute. Think about your story. Think about your story. Not just the brief chapter that you're writing now, but think of it in the context of this grand narrative or a meta-narrative that began generations before you were born and will go generations after you're gone. Your parents authored certain chapters, right, of the story. Your grandparents wrote their own. Some chapters were filled with triumph, others with struggle. Some with wisdom, others with mistakes that left lasting consequences. But now it's your turn to pick up the pen. What makes marriage so extraordinary is this, that instead of writing your story alone, you get to choose a co-author. Together, you decide what kind of story you want to tell with your years. Will it be a story of healing what was broken in previous chapters, or building on the foundation that others laid, or maybe pioneering new territory for the generations to follow? This vision of marriage honors both partnership and individuality. It celebrates the ways that couples can raise children together while also pursuing shared dreams that extend beyond their household. And it recognizes that the strongest marriages aren't built solely on emotional connection, although it matters deeply, but on the profound satisfaction that comes from two people aligning their deepest values to write a story together that matters. When marriage serves this larger narrative, the daily rhythms of family life become sacred acts within the ongoing creation of something beautiful and lasting. The morning coffee conversations become moments of co-authoring the day ahead. The evening walks become times to reflect on the progress of the day. The weekend projects become tangible expressions of the world that we're building together. And the bedtime prayers become whispered hopes for the story you're leaving your children. This is marriage as it was intended to be. Two people who understand that their individual stories are made more meaningful when woven together into a shared narrative that honors the generations before them and serves the generations to come. It's the recognition that we were not created as isolated characters, but as part of an ongoing story. These are my thoughts on what marriage could become. You have even greater insight, but together we can create a compelling narrative for a society that is desperately seeking hope. Right, Joni? Joni is my partner in hope for the most important relationships. In closing, let me say this. It is not naive optimism to believe that if you look at history and if you examine the emerging evidence, we are on the threshold of something new for marriage. Is this a marriage renaissance? Possibly. But I'll tell you this, there's a new respect for marriage. We're witnessing the early signs of a relational reset driven by loneliness, family fragmentation, and the search for meaning. And the biological tide is pulling us toward a cultural renaissance of connection. Folks, we're already there. We need to recognize it. And we need to have fresh eyes for what's happening around us. And we need to quit reciting to each other the bad news of the 50 years. We know that. We know that. Friends, this is your moment to lead. The question isn't whether this shift is happening. It's how we, as leaders, will shape it. You are the leaders of the marriage movement. Our calling as leaders of the marriage movement is to communicate the beauty and possibilities, Calvin, of marriage to a culture lost and longing for connection. So will we stay caught up in the hurricane, reacting to every gust of wind and crash of waves? Or will we learn to read the deeper rhythm, to flow with the biological tide that is reshaping the world around us? Friends, the hurricane will pass, but the tide endures. The data supports it. The human heart demands it. Will you lead and flow with it? Thank you.